In this section, we would be discussing the impact of globalization on the movement of the people across the borders. Historically, it is a known fact that people move from one part of the world to the other. This movement of the people from one part of the world to the other could be for the economic reasons, in the sense that looking for better economic opportunities in different parts of the world. It could also be that they would be compelled to move from their geographical locations for various reasons. The reasons could be in the form of a discrimination, in the form of a conflict, or in the form of natural disasters. So, there is a possibility of movement of people from one part of the world to the other. When we discussed in the beginning of this lecture, we looked at we underlined the fact that the process of globalization is not evenly impacting everyone or every aspect, because there are certain variations and there is no similar impact on every dimension or every context, and that is very much evident when we come to the question, when we deal with the question of the movement of the people. It is generally argued that the process of globalization has facilitated the movement of the capital and the goods across, and therefore, there is a free flow of economic activities across the borders. Therefore, it is argued that the way we are trying to facilitate the economic activities across the borders by way of facilitating investment and by way of promoting the movement of goods, we should also encourage in a similar manner the movement of the people, which means that people from one part of the world can go to some other part of the world, either for the purpose of economic work or for the purpose of better social conditions and better cultural life. So, therefore, there has to be equal, or at least an equal emphasis should be laid on the movement of the people, the way we are emphasizing on the economic activities part of it. But ironically, if you look at the kind of restrictions that are being imposed on the movement of the people, in fact, it is growing more than what it used to be in the past, in the sense that in the last 2 decades or so, there are more and more restrictions which are being imposed on the movement of the people. Now, when I refer to the movement of the people, there are for several reasons people move from one part of the world to the other, but I would be primarily dealing with only 2 aspects of this movement of the people. One is generally referred to as economic migration, that is, people move from one place to the other for better economic conditions. The other is with regard to refugees. Refugees are those people who are compelled to move because of fear of persecution for various reasons which are provided under the international legal framework, that is the Refugee Convention of 1951. So, in the case of refugees, it is that they are being forced to move from their geographical location to some other country, and that is crossing their own country's borders and entering into some other country, which is generally seen as a very grave situation. It is so because in the context of economic migration, though you are compelled to move because of economic reasons, but it is generally understood that there is a voluntariness involved in economic migration, which is a contestable issue, because it is not always a voluntary situation, because you are being compelled to move because of certain economic conditions where you will not be able to meet your economic requirements. Leaving that argument aside, when it comes to the question of refugees, it is primarily because of the persecution people move from one part of the world to the other. Now, this international legal framework, that is 1951 Refugee Convention, was drafted and came into existence after the Second World War, mainly to address the situation of the post Second World War refugee conditions. So, the law came into force that was primarily meant for European situation, but later on got extended to through a protocol of 1967 to all the countries in the world. So, the international legal framework that governs the movement of the refugees now is the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is applicable to all those states which are parties to it. And this international legal framework dealing with refugees contains an important principle, that is principle of non-refoulement, in this, which means that people should not be sent back to a location where there is a fear of persecution based on the legal framework that is provided under the 51 Convention. So, there is an obligation for states not to send the asylum seekers back or refugees back to any location where there is a fear of persecution. So, this is a well established legal principle which came through the 1951 Convention, which was specifically meant for European states and later on got extended to it. But for various political and other factors, from the days of the end of the second Cold War, there has been a continuous dilution of this international legal framework, where primarily the first world, that is the European states and the North American states, are imposing certain restrictions on the movement of or on the reception of the asylum seekers and refugees. Without going into the details of that political situation, primarily focusing on the legal framework, when there is a well established international obligation to respect the rights of the asylum seekers and the refugees, there is a process of a dilution taking place as part of the legal obligation. The most important measure which is being undertaken by those who want to discourage refugees is by way of criminalizing the border control system, in the sense that strengthening or tightening the border control as well as criminalizing any movement of people without proper documentation. In fact, the Refugee Convention provides for the possibility of people moving from one part of the world to other as refugees even without a proper documentation. But the several measures, international law measures, which have come into play in the last 2 decades or so, or more than 2 decades or so, are imposing certain restrictions on the movement of the people by strengthening the border measures. So, there is no possibility of people freely moving and seeking the refugee status, even if they are under threat, under there is a fear of persecution wherever they are placed. So, therefore, there are more and more restrictions which are coming into play on the movement of the people, that is on migrants and refugees. When it comes to the question of migration also, if you can look at it, there is a general anti-immigrant tendency that is growing primarily in the first world. So, therefore, there is a general tendency not to encourage any kind of immigration. There is a general tendency not to accept any asylum seekers and refugees. So, there is a more and more restrictions are being imposed by these states. Now, this in many respects goes against the existing human rights as well as the refugee law framework. Now, what is it that this phenomenon needs to be understood? On the one hand, there is a more movement of economic activities moving from the first world in the third world, but there is a more and more restrictions happening on the movement of the people, probably from the first world, but also it takes probably from the third world to the first world. So, therefore, there is a restriction on the movement of the people happening. So, which is, when we look at or analyze this situation in the context of globalization, it goes against the fundamental tenets of what constitutes a globalization, which is in terms of diluting the nation state borders, or at least reducing the impact of the nation state borders. The way we are trying to do that in the case of economic activity, we are working in a reverse manner by way of imposing more and more restrictions on the movement of the people. That is the reason why you see that as a result of these restrictions, since there are situations which are hostile to the living conditions of the people, people are compelled to move. But since there is no friendly reception by wherever they go, they are resorting to they are compelled to resort to other means of escaping from the kind of conditions that they live in, kind of a discrimination or a conflict situation. Because of these reasons, many a time they resort to smugglers and traffickers. They end up falling into the hands of the human smugglers and human traffickers. And also sometimes they pass through certain dangerous routes to reach the destination. That most of the times it happens across the Mediterranean, people moving from the other side to the European side through the Mediterranean. In a large number of people die on way, because the kind of boats that they resort to, the kind of boats that they travel on are extremely dangerous. So therefore, they kind of they put their lives at stake to reach those destinations where they would like to have refugees status. It is happening not because they desperately want to go, but not because they want to resort to only that means, but because their free movement is being restricted, therefore they are resorting to other means. Now this needs to be addressed as an urgent basis, because it goes against the general understanding of what we think as the process of globalization in other fields, but it is going in a contradictory way, especially with regard to the movement of the people, that is in the form of migrants and refugees. So to re-emphasize that and to conclude the discussion, as I said in the beginning, the process of globalization is not evenly affecting everyone, and that is evidently we can experience, or we can see that when it comes to the rights of the indigenous people, when it comes to the rights of the small landholders whose land is being acquired, or the indigenous people who are being removed off from their collective property rights framework, or wherever they are enjoying the natural resources, they are being deprived of those rights, as well as it is affecting adversely on the movement of the people. So therefore, there is a need for understanding the impact of the globalization in all its dimensions, and see to it that its adverse impacts need to be addressed to prevent further damage being caused to those vulnerable sections, those subaltern groups and subordinated people. Thank you.